My motive, my desire, my aim for this morning is to encourage you not to be ashamed of the gospel. We're starting a new series of Sunday morning talks called Courageous for Christ, and we're using the book of Romans as the foundation for this series. And the motive behind the whole series is to equip you to carry the gospel to a world that is increasingly blind to it. We're called to carry the gospel to a society that sometimes sees it as a threat, and especially that sees religion as something that should be kept into the private sphere, particularly Christian faith. And you'll often hear people say, it's all right for you to be a Christian, that's fine. But don't bring it into your workplace. Don't bring it into your school. And woe betide you if you pray with one of your clients. My friends, with the current state of our nation, the Christian church in Britain will only thrive, I believe, if it is characterised by courage. And I want to take this book of Romans and unpack it so that we can see how it is we can be courageous for Christ in a society that is increasingly moving away from his standards and ethics. You see, I don't want to be a person who will passively roll over and accept the status quo and to sort of swim along with the tide and say, oh yes, it's all okay. I want to be able to stand up for the truth of the gospel and see its power at work. Stand with honesty and grace and integrity, yes, but stand nonetheless. And the church will thrive into the next decade and beyond only if we strengthen our muscles of faith and act courageously. Now, before we get into the text itself, here's a truth I want to share with you. Oh, no need to be ashamed, it's on the screen. You've got that on your notes, Romans chapter 1, 1:17. You know all that now. Okay, here's a truth I want to share with you. That courage for Christ is a consequence of confidence in Christ. Courage for Christ is a consequence of confidence in Christ. In these next few months, I'm going to be urging us to take our gospel outside of these four walls. And Romans talks about what happens when the gospel impacts people's lives. And we easily talk, we easily converse, we easily communicate things that we're confident about. In our church, we have some Plymouth Argyle supporters. Well, at least one. And when he's in conversation, when you're in conversation with him, you will, as soon as you start talking about football, you will quickly hear about Plymouth Argyle. I won't identify him because I don't want to embarrass Colin McMahon. But when we have confidence in something, we will talk about it naturally. And my friends, if looking at this book, we can do that, I believe God will be doing great work in our lives, don't you? Because actually, if you're not feeling too confident about your faith, Romans is your friend. There's so much in here that helps us to be confident in the gospel and in what God is doing and to be able to communicate it well. Well, let's start right at the very beginning, shall we, with Romans chapter 1 and observe the very obvious that it is a letter. And usually when we write a letter, we put the address on the top, we write, dear so-and-so, and then we write the text of the letter and we put our name at the end. I'm sure they didn't do that in the first century because if you put your name at the end, you'd have to unroll the whole of the scroll to find out who sent you the beastly thing. In the first century, they did a very simple thing. It would always be, from Ian to Alex, hi. And that's how it would always start. Or greetings. And that's how Romans starts. Well, sort of. Actually, this is an intensely personal message. And so even in his greeting, we've discovered Paul using the personal pronoun, I, me, myself. In fact, in the first few paragraphs, it's used no less than 20 times. And they would have expected, when they picked it up to read it, or when they received it to be read, they would have expected to hear, Paul, to the Christians in Rome, greetings. And then get on with the text. But instead, they had something very different. And in those first few verses, Paul says some profound things about who he is and why he is here. First of all, in verse 1, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God. Paul is identifying himself to his Roman readers here. And the word servant is the word for a bond slave, someone owned by a master and committed to giving his whole life to the master's service. And there is a long history of bond slaves to God. Moses described himself in these terms, as so did Joshua. They considered themselves slaves to Yahweh, slaves to God. And that's what we're called to be, servants of Christ. We've been set apart by the Lord to do his will and to make a difference in this world. Now, while we're all called to be servants of Christ, we're not all called to be apostles of Christ, as Paul was. Now, an apostle is somebody who is sent. In the same way that an ambassador is sent by Britain to another country to represent Britain, an apostle is somebody sent by Christ to represent him and to build his church. Jesus used this word to describe the 12 closest disciples whom he sent with the message of the gospel into the world. It was used in the early church to identify people who were eyewitnesses of the resurrection. And Paul uses it more widely to indicate people who've been called by God and gifted for a specific ministry of building a church. So we can see that there's a huge difference between these two terms. The term slave is a title of great humility. As slaves, we have no rights to demand anything of our master. As apostle, that's a title of great authority. Anyone who is sent by Christ, commissioned to do his work, operates under the delegated authority of God himself. And so Paul describes himself both as a slave and an apostle. And then he says, I have been set apart for this ministry. This was his life's purpose. Paul saw that the reason God had put him on planet Earth was to understand, to explain and to proclaim and defend the gospel. He had been trusted by God with the gospel, just like we have. And he was called, sent and set apart to proclaim it. Now, we might say, well, of course, surely this is only the beginning of a letter. Why is Paul saying all this? Actually, I think the answer is quite simple. He has never been to Rome. He's never seen the Christians he was writing to. He has yet to visit them. So they needed to know who he was so that they could be confident in what he says later on. And I expect that some of the stories about Paul, the persecutor of the church, may have reached Rome. Were those stories true? Or had this man truly changed his colours and become a great advocate for the gospel instead of its opponent? So in a time when dire and negative stories about the church circulate in our media too, we need to stand for the real thing, for the gospel of Christ, and identify ourselves as Christians in the same way that Paul identified himself to the Romans, so that they knew who it was that was writing to. Now, if Paul is standing for the gospel of Christ, if that's his life's purpose, that begs the question, exactly what is the gospel? What is the gospel that he was communicating? Well, verse 2 and on give us a few hints here. First of all, in verse 2, we see that it is a message promised by God. The gospel he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. The gospel was not something that Paul had concocted to suit his own purposes or to puff up his own reputation. The gospel didn't come to Paul as a novelty or some sort of subjective revelation. He wasn't dreaming dreams or seeing visions in the sky. This gospel had been promised by God in the Scriptures for centuries. And And the Old Testament prophets, they witnessed to Jesus. Many of their writings, although they were written for the time, for the people at the time, for the benefit and blessing of the people at the time, when we look back at them, we can see the extraordinary extent to which so many of the prophetic scriptures point towards Jesus Christ. You see, prophecy is only recognised in retrospect. We look back and we see somebody writing in the distant past and realise that actually that's been fulfilled now. It was a message promised by God, the gospel. God was communicating good news about his love of mankind long before Jesus arrived in Bethlehem. But not only is it a message promised by God, it also points to Christ, as I've already hinted. Verse 3 tells us that this gospel is regarding or relating to God's Son. It is essentially about a person, Jesus Christ. The gospel is not about being a good or being a nice person, although I'm sure you're all very good, very nice people. It's not about religious observance, although we're all here. It's not about giving money, although many of us have already sacrificed this week and through the bank our resources to bless God's work, and he'll honour us for that. It's not even about knowing the Bible. Any Tom, Dick and Harry can read the Bible. Although I want you to know it as thoroughly as possible. Now, all these things are good. But the gospel fundamentally is about Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who he was, who he is, and who he will be. And so Paul expands what this gospel is about. He tells us that it points to Jesus. But what sort of Jesus? Well, he says Jesus who, verse 3, who as to his early life was a descendant of David. Here Paul is pointing out the human side of Jesus. Jesus had a human genealogy like all of us. He wasn't an angelic or a mystical being. Through his mother's line he could trace his lineage way, way back. I don't know if any of you have watched the BBC programmes. Who Do You Think You Are? Have you seen any of those? Where they take some celebrity and they dig into their past and try and find out all sorts of juicy bits. And apparently the celebrity doesn't know in advance of shooting the programme what it is they're going to reveal. And actually that's what makes that programme sometimes so very moving. Well, the BBC, had they been around at the time, they could have shot a Who Do You Think You Are programme about Jesus Christ, because he had a mother and his lineage could be traced back. But Paul says there's more to it than that. Yes, he was a human being, but he was appointed Son of God. Look at verse 4. Who through the Spirit of holiness was appointed the Son of God. And what was it that identified Jesus Christ as the Son of God? In power by his resurrection from the dead. Jesus Christ, our Lord. The one thing, or the one major thing that Paul says identifies Jesus Christ as the Son of God is not his teaching or his miracles, it is his resurrection. Because at that point, Jesus was unable to teach and incapable of performing a miracle. It was God who raised Christ from the dead. And that's an important distinction. And it was that verified, above all these other wonderful things, that verified that Jesus Christ was God's Son. I vividly remember when I was a student studying mathematics, having some quite serious doubts about my faith. And it was studying the resurrection that made me much more confident. I probably should have been studying Roller's theorem, or combinatorial analysis, or something like that. But actually I was reading a book about the resurrection. And it was reading this book about the resurrection, one by John Stott actually, called Basic Christianity, that really helped me to have a solid faith and to realise that I was not being asked to turn my mind off as a Christian. That my Christian faith was intellectually and historically tenable, that the gospel was a realistic and an intellectually acceptable thing to follow, that I don't have to turn my brain off to believe. So Jesus was a human being, and he was appointed the Son of God, and that was demonstrated most powerfully in the resurrection. Now, if the gospel is all about a person, that begs another question. And that is, what does Jesus do? What part does he play? Well, verse 5 unpacks that for us. Paul says, through him we have received grace. So Christ is the grace giver. God's generosity comes through him. But not only that, verse 5 tells us, we receive grace and apostleship to call all the Gentiles to the obedience that comes from faith in for his name's sake. So Jesus Christ is the giver of grace. He's also the sender of apostles. Apostleship is not something that one chooses to do as a career. It is God's calling on your life. And that shows us, you can see in verse 6, that he is the caller of people as Christians. And you, says Paul, also among those Gentiles who were called to belong to Christ. The gospel is not restricted to a particular group of people. It is universal in its application. It is the power of God for salvation or rescue to everyone who believes. And we're going to see as we look through the rest of this book that Paul was a patriotic Jew, and yes, he longed to see his own people saved, and so should we. We should long to see people around us come to faith. But he knew he was called to the Gentiles. These were people who previously he thought were totally beyond redemption, but God called Paul to reach them. And similarly, my friends, I believe God is going to call us to reach outside the walls of Victoria Baptist Church. To reach people who we might consider to be beyond the pale. He calls us to reach outside of our own orbit with the gospel. And that's only the introduction of Paul's letter. Actually, that's only the introduction to my sermon. I've got another 17 points to go. Do you realise that? Because the thrust of what I want to share with you this morning comes later on in the passage. And all of that is the foundation. Look at verse 14. Paul says, I am a debtor both to Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and the foolish. Now, what is this debt that he carries? Verse 15, that is why I'm so eager to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome. So his debt seems to be preaching the gospel. This is his obligation. That's how he's going to discharge his debt. It makes us wonder how you get into such a debt, how you pay it off, doesn't it? Now, just notice carefully that Paul is a debtor to other people, not to God. I'm a debtor, he says, to the Greeks and to the barbarians. Now, usually we get into debt because someone has loaned us something and we have to pay it back. But the situation is here it's not that the nations have loaned Paul anything to be paid back. That's a free gift. The gospel is God's free gift to Paul. So Paul can't be in debt to God, because you can't be in debt for a freebie, can you? That doesn't make sense. So here's the principle. When we receive grace from God, we become debtors to other people. Not to him, because it's grace. It's free. It wouldn't be grace otherwise. When we receive grace from God, we become debtors to other people. Grace cannot and must not be paid back as a debt. So when grace comes to us from God in the gospel, it places us in debt or in obligation to other people in the sense that they too need to experience God's gift. And we are the ones carrying it. And what I owe to them is the gospel of grace. That's discharging my debt. So the debt we owe is the gospel to other people. Verse 15 again. That is why I am so eager to preach the gospel also to you in Rome. He's eager to reach these people and just to share something with them about what God's doing. And my friends, we need to be eager too. We have a duty to our friends and families. We have a duty to our town. We have a duty to society at large to communicate the gospel, God's fantastic freebie. And that brings me, excuse me, that brings me to the thrust of this morning's message, and it's this. I am not ashamed of the gospel. That's what Paul says in verse 16. Some of us may be ashamed of the gospel, but Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. There is no embarrassment attached to it. There's no shame attached to it. And so Paul comes crashing in with this statement, I am not ashamed of this gospel that I've been called and sent to represent, to communicate. And some of us may be ashamed. And we feel guilty about being ashamed, and that's probably the right thing to feel. Because when we come to being open about our faith, or open about going to church, or open about attending our small group, or whatever, what do? We pussyfoot. We evade, we skirt around all this religious stuff. Don't forget, my friends, that you've been placed under obligation by God to be his ambassador and to share the gospel. You are in debt to the people around you. And that is one reason why God chose you to be where you are today and tomorrow and next week. Now, I think that probably applies to a fairly small number of us. Much more likely is it that when we seek to live out the gospel, to live as Christ would live, and to speak for Christ, to share our faith by talking about it when that's appropriate, we are unsure that we'll get it right. Or we feel we're ill-equipped to do very much. And I was saying earlier on, my friend, if you feel ill-equipped to share the gospel, Romans is your friend. And much more importantly, the Spirit of God is your enabler. I am not ashamed of the gospel, says Paul. Why? Because the gospel itself, is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew and then to the Gentile. Why did Paul have no need to be ashamed of the gospel? Because it has a power all of its own. Why can we be confident in it? No need to be ashamed of it. Because it has a power all of its own. He just had to tell it like it was and let the gospel do its work. When I was a kid, my father had a garage. The car was not often in the garage. And that's because our garage was a cornucopia of tools for woodwork. And he loved making things out of wood. If Mum wanted something in a particular place in the house, the next thing you'd know, Dad would make something out of wood and it would just be sitting there. Our whole house was an amazing little collection of different little places made out of wood, drawers and cupboards and all that kind of stuff. Yes, you went to my parents' house, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And I remember him trying to teach me how to do woodwork and how to cut a piece of wood with a tenon saw. And when it came to cutting the wood with a tenon saw, I just couldn't get the hang of it at all. And the more I pushed down, the more the saw bound into the wood, so that I just couldn't move it. And poor little Ian was getting really frustrated. And my dad used to say to me, Ian, just let the saw do its own work. And I would carry on pushing down with all my might and getting annoyed with it. And he said, Ian, you're trying to do the saw's work for it. You move the saw horizontally, and it will do the work vertically. And suddenly I got it. That I didn't have to ram this saw down in the wood to make it work. I just had to move it backwards and forwards. And it did the work for me. And that's the same with the gospel. It has a power all of its own. That's why I love doing things like Christianity Explored and Alpha and our Discovery Group and all these sort of Christian basic stuff. Because you share the gospel and discover the gospel doing its job. And if obviously you're here today, but if next week you want to go down to Christianity Explored, that's fine, we've got some space, you can go and do it. If you go down to Christianity Explored, I talk about down because it's meeting underneath the church, just down here. You go down to Christianity Explored, all you'll hear is a lot of facts, a lot of things about Jesus. In fact, I remember one chap on an Alpha once getting quite cross with me. He said, I came to find faith and you've given me evidence. The gospel has a power all of its own, and we don't have to embellish it or pressurise. All we have to do is share what God's done. God's fantastic freedom in the gospel.